Philo Taylor Farnsworth was born in 1906 in a small log cabin in Beaver, Utah, into a world that had not yet imagined television, computers, or digital screens. Electricity itself was still a novelty in many parts of the United States, and the idea of transmitting images through the air belonged more to science fiction than to science. Farnsworth's parents were farmers, deeply rooted in a rural lifestyle that valued hard work, discipline, and self-sufficiency. Nothing about his early environment suggested access to elite education, advanced laboratories, or powerful investors. Yet from an early age, Farnsworth showed an unusual relationship with technology and abstract thinking. Unlike many children, he did not simply use machines, he wanted to understand how they worked internally. When the Farnsworth family moved to a farm in Idaho that had recently been electrified, the presence of electricity had a profound impact on Philo. He became fascinated by how invisible forces could be transformed into light, motion, and sound. He read any technical material he could find, often studying material intended for college students while still in his early teens. At this time, scientists around the world were attempting to solve the problem of visual transmission. Radio had already proven that sound could be sent across long distances, but images posed a much greater challenge. Most existing systems relied on mechanical scanning devices, such as spinning discs with holes, mirrors, or rotating drums. These systems were slow, fragile, and fundamentally limited in resolution and stability. Many researchers believed mechanical television was the only possible approach. Philo Farnsworth thought differently. At the age of 14, while plowing a field on his family's farm, he noticed the way the plow carved the soil into neat, parallel rows. This simple agricultural pattern sparked a revolutionary idea. Farnsworth realized that an image could be broken down into horizontal lines, scanned one line at a time, converted into electrical signals, transmitted, and then reconstructed elsewhere. This was the birth of electronic scanning. Crucially, Farnsworth understood that mechanical parts would never be fast or precise enough to handle this process effectively. Instead, electrons themselves could be used to scan and reproduce images. This insight placed him far ahead of many established researchers, even though he lacked formal credentials or institutional backing. Later that same year, Farnsworth drew detailed diagrams of his concept on the blackboard in his high school classroom. These drawings outlined a complete system for electronic television, including image scanning, signal transmission, and image reconstruction. His science teacher, Justin Tolman, immediately recognized the originality of the work. Tolman preserved the drawings by copying them and signing them with the date, unknowingly creating evidence that would later play a decisive role in one of the most important patent disputes in technological history. Despite his intellectual brilliance, Farnsworth faced severe limitations. His family struggled financially, especially after the sudden death of his father. Economic hardship forced him to leave school temporarily and work to support his family. During this period, Farnsworth's dream of building a functional electronic television seemed increasingly distant. Nevertheless, he continued to experiment in any way he could. Using discarded components, salvaged vacuum tubes, and improvised equipment, Farnsworth built small circuits and tested theories late into the night. He was not simply copying existing research, he was inventing new principles from scratch. His work focused on controlling electron beams with magnetic and electric fields, an approach that would later define television technology for decades. By his late teens, Farnsworth had developed enough confidence in his ideas to seek financial backing. In 1926, he met George Everson and Leslie Gorel, two investors who were intrigued by his intelligence and determination. Though neither fully understood the technical details, they recognized Farnsworth's potential and agreed to fund his research. This decision marked the transition from isolated experimentation to serious development. With their support, Farnsworth moved to San Francisco and established a small laboratory. The lab was modest by any standard, lacking the resources of major research institutions, but it provided Farnsworth with the freedom to pursue his vision without interference. He worked obsessively, often for days without rest, refining his electronic imaging system. In September 1927, Farnsworth achieved a historic breakthrough. He successfully transmitted the first fully electronic television image. The image itself was simple, a straight line, but it proved that electronic scanning worked. Unlike mechanical systems, there were no moving parts involved in image capture or reproduction. Everything was controlled electronically. This moment represented a fundamental shift in the future of visual media. Farnsworth had solved the core problem that had limited television development for decades. However, instead of recognition and support, his success attracted the attention of powerful forces that would soon challenge his ownership of the invention. At the same time Farnsworth was perfecting his system, the Radio Corporation of America, known as RCA, was aggressively expanding its control over emerging technologies. RCA dominated radio broadcasting and electronics manufacturing in the United States. Its leadership understood that television would be the next major technological frontier, and they were determined to control it. RCA employed some of the most prominent engineers of the era, including Vladimir Zworykin, a talented scientist who had worked on television-related research. Although Zworykin had filed patents related to image tubes, his systems had not yet produced a fully functional electronic television. When RCA learned of Farnsworth's success, it recognized both a threat and an opportunity. In 1930, Zworykin visited Farnsworth's laboratory. Officially, the visit was framed as a scientific exchange. In reality, it was a reconnaissance mission. Farnsworth demonstrated his system openly, unaware of the corporate implications. Zworykin carefully observed every component, asked detailed questions, and examined the underlying principles. After the visit, Zworykin reportedly acknowledged Farnsworth's achievement, privately admitting that Farnsworth was ahead. However, RCA did not intend to collaborate. Instead, it intensified its own research efforts, aiming to replicate Farnsworth's system while claiming prior invention. Soon afterward, RCA began filing patent applications that closely resembled Farnsworth's designs. This marked the beginning of a prolonged legal battle that would define Farnsworth's life. RCA challenged the originality of Farnsworth's patents, arguing that similar ideas existed in earlier research and that Farnsworth had not truly invented electronic television. Farnsworth, still in his early 20s, suddenly found himself facing one of the most powerful corporations in the world. He lacked the financial resources to engage in prolonged litigation, yet his entire future depended on defending his work. The patent battle consumed his time, energy, and emotional stability. During the hearings, Farnsworth presented the signed high school drawings preserved by Justin Tolman. These documents provided clear evidence that Farnsworth had conceived the core principles of electronic television years before RCA's claims. The Patent Office examined the evidence carefully. In a rare and significant decision, the Patent Office ruled in Farnsworth's favor. RCA was forced to acknowledge that Farnsworth held priority over key aspects of electronic television. This ruling should have secured his place in history and ensured fair compensation. Instead, it triggered a new phase of conflict. After the Patent Office ruled in Philo Farnsworth's favor, many assumed that the conflict with RCA was over. In reality, it was only beginning. RCA did not operate like an ordinary company. It was a technological empire with deep ties to government regulators, broadcasters, manufacturers, and financial institutions. Losing a patent dispute to a young, independent inventor was not something RCA was willing to accept quietly. Instead of directly overturning the decision, RCA shifted its strategy. The company chose delay, exhaustion, and financial pressure as its primary weapons. Appeals were filed. Hearings were prolonged. Legal costs mounted. Farnsworth, who lacked the nearly unlimited resources of RCA, was forced to divert more and more of his time away from engineering and toward legal defense. At the same time, RCA accelerated its internal television program. Vladimir Zworykin continued refining image tubes that increasingly resembled Farnsworth's concepts. RCA's laboratories were equipped with the best tools and staffed by large teams of engineers. Even though Farnsworth legally owned the core ideas, RCA was rapidly closing the technological gap through sheer scale and funding. This imbalance created a cruel paradox. Farnsworth was the inventor, but RCA was becoming the dominant producer. Television sets, experimental broadcasts, and public demonstrations increasingly carried the RCA name. To the public, RCA appeared to be leading the television revolution, while Farnsworth remained largely invisible. Eventually, RCA made a calculated move. Rather than attempting to fully invalidate Farnsworth's patents, it offered a licensing agreement. On paper, this appeared to be a victory for Farnsworth. RCA would pay to use his inventions. In reality, the deal was structured to benefit RCA far more than the inventor. The licensing fees were limited, time-bound, and carefully designed to minimize long-term payments. Farnsworth received some income, but nowhere near the value generated by the widespread adoption of television. More importantly, RCA retained control over manufacturing, broadcasting standards, and public messaging. Farnsworth's name was largely excluded from promotional material and public narratives. While RCA was consolidating its dominance, Farnsworth attempted to commercialize his own television systems through Farnsworth Television and Radio Corporation. The company struggled from the beginning. Television was still an emerging technology, and the economic environment of the Great Depression made investment risky. Manufacturing costs were high, consumer demand was uncertain, and competition from corporate giants was relentless. Despite these challenges, Farnsworth's team achieved several technical milestones. They improved image quality, increased resolution, and demonstrated fully functional television broadcasts. In purely technical terms, Farnsworth's systems were competitive and, in some cases, superior. However, technological superiority did not guarantee market success. RCA controlled radio networks, had relationships with retailers, and influenced emerging broadcasting standards. This allowed the company to shape the ecosystem in its favor. Farnsworth's products struggled to gain shelf space and distribution. As the years passed, the pressure began to take a toll on Farnsworth personally. The constant legal battles, financial uncertainty, and sense of injustice affected his mental health. He became increasingly withdrawn, experiencing periods of depression and exhaustion. The invention that had once filled him with excitement now represented endless conflict. The strain extended to his family life as well. Farnsworth's wife, Elma Pem Farnsworth, played a critical role throughout this period. She provided emotional support, managed business affairs, and stood by him during court battles. Without her, it is likely Farnsworth would not have endured the prolonged struggle. Meanwhile, RCA continued to refine its public image as the architect of television. Demonstrations at world fairs, press coverage, and advertising campaigns emphasized RCA's role in bringing television to the masses. The company's engineers were celebrated as pioneers, while Farnsworth remained largely unknown outside technical and legal circles. World events further complicated the situation. As tensions rose in Europe and the United States moved toward World War II, government priorities shifted. Television development slowed as resources were redirected toward military technologies. For Farnsworth, this pause offered little relief. His patents were aging, and every year that passed reduced their long-term value. When the United States entered the war, Farnsworth contributed his expertise to defense-related projects. He worked on radar and other electronic systems, applying the same principles of electron control that underpinned television. These contributions were valuable, but they did not restore his position in the television industry. By the time the war ended, the television landscape had changed dramatically. RCA emerged stronger than ever, positioned to dominate the post-war boom in consumer electronics. Farnsworth, by contrast, found himself increasingly sidelined. Many of his key patents were approaching expiration, opening the door for unrestricted use by large manufacturers. The expiration of Farnsworth's patents marked a turning point. Once the legal protections disappeared, corporations could freely use the electronic scanning principles he had invented without paying royalties. Television production exploded, entering millions of homes across America and eventually the world. Ironically, this was the moment Farnsworth should have benefited most from his work. Instead, it marked the end of his financial leverage. The system he had created became ubiquitous, yet he had little control over its future and received minimal compensation. Public recognition remained elusive. Textbooks, news articles, and popular histories often credited RCA or generalized industry research with the invention of television. Farnsworth's role was minimized or omitted entirely. For a man who had devoted his life to a single idea, this erasure was devastating. As the years passed, Farnsworth struggled to find new purpose. He continued to invent, turning his attention to ambitious projects such as nuclear fusion. His work on fusion, particularly the Farnsworth-Hirsch fusor, demonstrated that his creative mind remained sharp. Yet these projects faced their own challenges and never achieved the transformative impact of television. Emotionally, Farnsworth carried deep scars from the television war. He spoke openly about feeling betrayed by a system that rewarded corporate power over individual creativity. In private conversations, he expressed regret not over inventing television, but over believing that fairness would prevail. By the late 1960s, Farnsworth's health had declined significantly. Years of stress, combined with alcohol dependence and depression, took their toll. He watched as television became the dominant medium of global communication, shaping culture, politics, and entertainment on a massive scale. Yet despite the ubiquity of his invention, Farnsworth himself remained largely invisible. His name was absent from corporate histories and rarely mentioned in public discussions. The inventor of electronic television had been effectively erased from the story of his own creation. As the 1950s began, television entered what many historians would later call its golden age. Sets became more affordable, broadcasting expanded rapidly, and television transformed from a technological curiosity into a central fixture of everyday life. Families gathered around their screens for news, entertainment, sports, and political events. Television reshaped culture, commerce, and public discourse on a scale few technologies had ever achieved. At the center of this transformation were the very principles Philo Farnsworth had envisioned decades earlier. Electronic scanning, raster lines, controlled electron beams, image pickup tubes, and synchronized signal transmission formed the foundation of every television system in operation. Yet as the industry flourished, Farnsworth's presence within it continued to fade. RCA and other large corporations dominated the post-war television boom. They controlled manufacturing, broadcasting networks, advertising, and public perception. Corporate narratives emphasized institutional innovation, team-based research, and brand identity. Individual inventors, especially those who did not belong to corporate laboratories, were rarely highlighted. For Farnsworth, this erasure was not merely symbolic. It had real financial and emotional consequences. Once his patents expired, he no longer received licensing fees from the technology he had created. Television manufacturers generated enormous profits, while Farnsworth struggled to maintain financial stability. Despite these challenges, Farnsworth never fully abandoned his identity as an inventor. He believed deeply in the power of science to improve humanity and continued to pursue ambitious ideas. Among these was his work on controlled nuclear fusion, a concept that aimed to produce clean, virtually limitless energy. The Farnsworth-Hirsch fusor, developed in the late 1950s and early 1960s, demonstrated that nuclear fusion could be achieved in a compact device. While the fusor did not lead to commercial fusion power, it remains a significant contribution to experimental physics and is still studied and used in research today. This work reaffirmed Farnsworth's brilliance, even as mainstream recognition eluded him. Yet the emotional weight of the television battle never disappeared. Farnsworth spoke openly about his bitterness toward the corporate system that had, in his view, stolen not only his invention but his life's purpose. In interviews, he described television as a monster he had unleashed upon the world, expressing regret that it had been used more for entertainment than education. These comments were not the words of a man who hated technology. They were the reflections of someone who felt deeply betrayed. Farnsworth had believed that invention would lead to understanding, recognition, and fairness. Instead, he experienced a system in which power and capital dictated historical memory. By the late 1960s, Farnsworth's health deteriorated further. Years of stress, combined with heavy drinking and depression, weakened his body. He withdrew from public life, rarely attending industry events or conferences. To most of the world, he was no longer part of the story of television. In 1971, Philo Farnsworth died at the age of 64. His death passed with little public notice. There were no major tributes from the television industry, no widespread acknowledgement of his role in shaping modern media. The inventor of electronic television left the world quietly, almost anonymously. For many years after his death, the narrative surrounding television remained largely unchanged. Textbooks credited corporations or highlighted engineers associated with major companies. Farnsworth's name appeared occasionally in technical footnotes, but rarely in mainstream histories. This began to change slowly in the late 20th century, as historians, engineers, and journalists revisited the origins of television. Court records, patent documents, and personal accounts revealed the depth of Farnsworth's contribution. Scholars increasingly recognized that electronic television, as it exists today, would not have been possible without his early breakthroughs. Gradually, Farnsworth's story re-emerged. Museums dedicated exhibits to his work. Academic papers cited his patents as foundational. Documentaries and books began to tell the story of the young inventor who had stood alone against a corporate giant and won, at least legally. Yet even this recognition came too late to benefit Farnsworth himself. His life serves as a case study in how innovation is often divorced from reward, and how historical credit can be shaped by power rather than truth. Today, it is impossible to escape the legacy of television. Screens are everywhere. They are in living rooms, bedrooms, offices, public spaces, and pockets. They deliver information, shape opinions, and define cultural moments. From global news broadcasts to viral videos, the modern world is mediated through screens. Every one of these screens relies on principles first imagined by a teenage farm boy plowing a field in Idaho. The idea that images could be broken into lines, converted into electrical signals, and reassembled elsewhere remains central to modern display technology, even in digital form. Farnsworth's story also resonates far beyond television. It reflects a broader pattern repeated throughout technological history. Individual inventors often create revolutionary ideas, only to be overshadowed by corporations with the resources to commercialize and control them. Patents, intended to protect innovation, can become tools of attrition when wielded by powerful entities. The battle between Farnsworth and RCA was not simply a legal dispute. It was a clash between two visions of innovation. One emphasized individual creativity, insight, and persistence. The other prioritized scale, control, and market dominance. In the end, both shaped the world, but not equally in memory. This dynamic continues today in fields ranging from software to biotechnology to artificial intelligence. Independent researchers and small startups regularly find themselves competing with multinational corporations capable of absorbing, replicating, or legally challenging their ideas. Farnsworth's experience remains deeply relevant. His life raises difficult questions. Who truly owns an invention? Is it the person who conceives it, or the entity that profits from it? How should society balance individual creativity against corporate efficiency? And how many inventors have been forgotten because they lacked the power to control their own narrative? In recent years, efforts have been made to restore Farnsworth's place in history. Schools have been named after him. Awards have been established in his honor. His hometowns have celebrated his achievements. These gestures cannot undo the struggles he endured, but they help correct the historical record. Still, for many viewers watching television today, Farnsworth's name remains unfamiliar. This invisibility is perhaps the final injustice of his story. A world shaped by his ideas rarely acknowledges the mind behind them. Philo Farnsworth did not invent television for fame or fortune. He invented it because he believed it was possible. His curiosity, imagination, and determination allowed him to see beyond the limitations of his time. In doing so, he changed the world. Yet his story reminds us that invention alone is not enough. Recognition, protection, and fairness depend on systems that do not always reward originality. Farnsworth's legacy is therefore both inspirational and cautionary. He stands as a symbol of the countless inventors whose contributions underpin modern life, even as their names fade into obscurity. Their ideas live on in the technologies we use every day, silently shaping our world. And that is the hidden battle behind television.